You could find your seats. We're starting imminently in a matter of seconds. Here it comes. Ready? Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. I'm Carter Sneed. I have the honor of being the director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. And I'm delighted that you've joined us this evening for our 23rd annual fall conference titled Dust of the Earth on Persons. We're thrilled to have so many friends, old and new, joining us for this year's conference, which is always the highlight of the fall semester for us here at the University of Notre Dame. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work at the DeNicola Center, we were established in 1999 by our visionary founder, David Solomon, who is sitting right here. And the purpose and mission of the DeNicola Center is to share the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and engagement at the highest level across a range of disciplines and in conversation with other traditions. We do this in four main ways: academic research and programming, of which the fall conference has become the centerpiece of our programming, along with several robust publication series with our friends at the University of Notre Dame Press, headed by the extraordinary Stephen Rinn. Since 2016, I believe, and Margaret will correct me if I'm wrong, we've published 28 volumes since 2016 with the Notre Dame Press. Alongside academic research and publications, we engage in the lifeblood of the university here is student formation. Through our Soren Fellows program, the flagship student formation program at the DeNicola Center for undergraduate and graduate students at the university, where they receive special mentoring and opportunities for research support and summer internships. We now have 550 Soren Fellows of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. And 1,000 alumni. We started in 2017 with 15 students. We are also the University of Notre Dame's operational arm for its institutional commitment to building a culture of life and love in which everyone is welcomed and supported, and their flourishing is supported from throughout all of life's journey, regardless of circumstance, and certainly regardless of the esteem in which they are held by others. And that's an essential element of what we do, both here on campus, at Notre Dame, but also in the global public square as the University of Notre Dame. And the fourth element of our work here is assisting the University of Notre Dame in its own mission to hire faculty who are committed to building a distinctive and interesting Catholic university. And again, not limited to Catholic faculty or even believers among the faculty, but people who want to build something interesting and exceptional here at what I believe is the greatest Catholic research university in the world. I'm not going to exaggerate. Since the center's founding, the Fall Conference has been our longest annual event. It's, I believe, a unique and exciting gathering of scholars, students, and friends from around the globe who come together every year to grapple with some of the most vital questions of ethics, culture, and public policy. This year's conference is our largest in the history of the Fall Conference. We have 1,100 guests registered for this year's event, during which we will consider the vexing questions related to our understanding of persons, their place in the world, and what we owe to one another in justice, solidarity, and friendship. Of particular interest to this year's conference are recent developments in biotechnology and the biosciences, artificial intelligence, legal doctrine and practice, the social sciences, theological reflection, ethics, art, architecture, and more. To help us wrestle with these questions, we're grateful once again to collaborate with Stanford University's Boundaries of Humanity project under the direction of my dear friend, Dr. Bill Hurlbut. The Boundaries of Humanity project seeks to deepen dialogue on human place and purpose in the cosmos, particularly with respect to conceptions of human uniqueness, human enhancement, and the potential impact of advancing biotechnology on the human future. We're grateful to have this opportunity to work alongside Bill and everyone else at the Boundaries Project, and we thank in a special way the John Templeton Foundation, whose support helped make this partnership possible. As we spend the next few days together discussing questions of persons and personhood, we'll be hearing from more than 140 speakers across the range of disciplines, including philosophy, medicine, theology, law, bioethics, art, literature, political science, and more. It promises to be a truly exciting 3 days. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Given the size of this year's conference, we'll be taking over both McKenna Hall across the street and the Morris Inn here. Sessions will be held in both buildings, so check your conference program carefully for these locations. And refreshments will be offered outside all of the presentation rooms, so feel free to spread out. We also invite you to visit the publishers and vendors in McKenna rooms 205 to 207, many of which are offering special conference discounts on volumes by our speakers. We're also pleased to provide a family room this year in McKenna, room 204 in McKenna, should anyone with small children need a place to get away during the conference. All these details can be found in your program. And now to introduce our evening's keynote speaker, the first invited speaker of this year's conference. It is an honor and a privilege to be joined this evening by Craig Calhoun, University Professor of Social Sciences at Arizona State University. A comparative and historical sociologist, social theorist, and scholar, Professor Calhoun is known for his interdisciplinary work in anthropology, communications, economics, history, international studies, political science, philosophy, and science and technology studies. His most recent books include Degenerations of Democracy, published in 2022 with Charles Taylor and Dilip Gaonkar, and The Green New Deal and the Future of Work, published the same year, co-edited with Benjamin Fong. He's also collaborated with former students to create widely used anthologies covering classical and contemporary sociological theory. Calhoun has authored 9 books and published over 150 peer-reviewed papers, articles, and chapters. Prior to joining Arizona State University, Professor Calhoun served as president and director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, president of the Social Science Research Council, and president of the Berggruen Institute. He has taught at Columbia University, New York University, where he founded the Institute for Public Knowledge, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he also served as dean of the graduate school and directed the University Center for International Studies. In addition, he has been a visiting professor at the universities and institutes in the US and abroad, including Asmara, Beijing, Bristol, Khartoum, Oslo, and Paris, and as an Einstein Fellow in Berlin. Calhoun's research focuses on contemporary transformations, possible futures, and the political economy of the modern world system. He is also committed to studying universities and knowledge institutions, democracy, and shifting structures of social solidarity. In his philosophical pursuits, Calhoun explores the relationship between transformation and transcendence in understanding human existence. Tonight, he will be addressing us in his talk entitled Persons Created, Artificial, and Natural. Please join me in welcoming Craig Calhoun.
It is a pleasure to thank Carter for his leadership and his invitation And a pleasure to say, I'm sure he didn't do it all alone. And there are a lot of other people I would be thanking if I knew all of their names. I'm grateful to everybody associated with the D. Nicholas Center and with bringing this conference together, which seems to be a pretty extraordinary thing to me. It's wonderful to look out and see not just this large audience, but this richly varied audience, which clearly includes students, and it may include some people older than me. So I think we're off to a good start here. I want to, in addition to thanking all those people, apologize to all the rest of you, because I'm pretty sure that there are occasions where I'm going to speak superficially about topics where more than one person in the room has a great depth of knowledge. Be easy with me if you would. But the scope of what I want to try to cover is very broad, and so it requires some skating over and not going into depth on every single moment in it. Let me begin. This unfamiliar computer. So personhood is basic to human life, right? But it's not basic to human life just because all people are automatically persons in every way of constructing and understanding persons. I want to particularly emphasize relationships as basic to human existence, but also to personhood. And so to say that we can mislead ourselves by having just a categorical distinction, you're in or you're out, you're a person or you're not, which has been common in many constructions. I want to stress the variability of these constructions. So I'm not just going to tell you the correct view of persons according to Craig Calhoun, but look at some of the way there has been variation, and variation not just in the construction, but the distribution. The idea of person has been almost an engine for exclusion, as often as it has been a basis for recognition of our shared existence. We have only to think about the ways in which constructions of who is a person have been used to justify slavery and colonization and invasion, in which they have underwritten the dehumanization of a variety of people and exclusions in our own society, justifying exclusions from constitutional protections for women, for people without property, for the enslaved, for Native Americans. Right? So the idea of person hasn't had an entirely benign relationship, and yet it has been crucial to things we value. And so we need to think about it with a critical attention to all of this, recognizing the various forms of denigration and even dehumanization, but not imagining that there's an easy way to wish all of this away and just say it doesn't matter, rather than to work through it and figure out how we can move forward. In this, I'm not going to get to develop very much, but we'll touch on the theme of becoming, of thinking of persons in process rather than thinking simply statically of being a person, rather than being in a relationship of becoming. But I am going to talk a little about how persons are created, right? Different ways of thinking about creation and transformation. Right? Finally, not all persons are human. And a central part of my emphasis is going to be on that. And part of the intended implication of this is for the present, as we think about not human or not fully human persons in the world of artificial intelligence, or with transformations of the physically human by genetic editing, or in a variety of other ways. And I'm going to suggest this isn't quite as new as we sometimes think, and see what lessons we can find from that. For example, right, there is something that is very familiar, at least if not in the pictures, in the words, to everybody in this room. The idea of God in three persons, the basic idea of the Trinity, appears as fundamental. A mystery that some will try to analyze and tease out, a mystery seen recently in the lenses of analytic theology differently from how it was seen for a long time, differently in Orthodox traditions and in Catholic, right? But I just want to remark on a couple of things about the Trinity and representations of the Trinity. First, the extent to which whatever the ultimate meaning, and I am not the right person to ask the ultimate meaning, whatever the ultimate meaning, this is disclosing different aspects or dimensions of reality. Okay? This is also opening different kinds of relationships to God for human beings and potentially situating those relations in different sorts of ways. Just to take the two paintings here, these two fairly classic iconographic representations, which present many things differently, right? There are questions about contextualization, right? In some representations of the Trinity, God, all three persons, is separate, alone, the whole of the visual field. In others, there's a situation. Notice in the painting on the left that there are people in relationship. There are fishes. There's not a whole suggestion of a great chain of being, but the development of an idea of the connections and hierarchical orderings of all life in the great chain of being can be implied. So we've had this, right, for a long time, and it should at least be making us think about persons. That constructions and distributions of personhood vary profoundly is a reminder that human beings exist only in culture and only with others. The others include, but are not limited to, human others. And I'm going to see if this can come up. Can it? No. All right, it will stay where it is. It's a person with a mind of its own. It's only in an era that has been deeply shaped by modern Western notions of nature that we habitually conflate the notions of human and person. Simply thinking of the Trinity should be a reminder that it's not automatic, right, to think that persons are human. It's not even clear that human person is always meaningful, and natural person is not always obviously a reference to a human being. Right? Are the three persons of God unnatural? What does that mean? Right? We have been immersed, we moderns, in a world of naturalism, a world of not just thinking that there is nature, but giving a positive evaluation to the naturalness of human beings in various ways that suffuses a lot of how we think about this. Raises questions about what we mean by nature, of course, as well as questions about what we mean by the artificial or the created. But note that a created person, right, is not a purely natural person, at least not necessarily. It depends a little on what you mean by creation. And it depends a lot on if you mean by creation, sort of capital C, divine creation, you definitely don't mean nature in every sense of the word, but also if you mean human creation, you don't mean nature in every sense of the word. Right? So I'm going to explore, right, some strands in the history of persons, not exhaustively, mainly in the classical world and briefly in the Renaissance and early modern too, but with present day intent, right? So my historical intent is to get to the present. I want to emphasize, as I already have, the variable construction of human persons, but also the variable recognition of human persons. I want to emphasize relationality, which is embedded in the very plan for this conference as one of the core themes of thinking about the relations in which humans live. But I also want to introduce the idea of individuality, that humans aren't automatically individuals, that in many ways we have divided beings. And in different cultures, the divisibility of human beings may be emphasized in important ways and tied to relationality, so that people are different in different relationships and understood to be importantly different in relationship. For example, names change in some traditions for parents when they have children and now appear as Uma or Abu, right, in relation to the children. They are different, and there are multiple roles that connect them inextricably to their fellows, right, are also linked to a dividuality rather than an individuality. From Augustine on especially, we've been very focused in the West on the idea of putting ourselves completely together and tying ourselves up with a neat bow, right? On being really individual. We've known that we have some conflicts. Augustine certainly knew he had a variety of conflicts and tensions, but the goal of unity was there. Debates over the unity of virtues have some of the same sorts of questions behind them. And I'm not going to settle any of this, except to say there's much more tradition of thinking about individuality, and it may be useful to us. I'm going to emphasize non-human persons. I'm going to continue with the non-human, particularly in relation to corporate persons. Major issue today, and problems with a simple contrast between natural and artificial persons. Most of what is written to try to clarify what corporations are works with a distinction to natural persons that is itself not clarified. Okay? That contrast runs through. And finally, I'm going to explore, at least I want to explore, but I think I'm really just going to assert the centrality of thinking less in terms of entities than relationships and creation and becoming and transformation. Let's start where the etymology must start. As I think most people will know, the term person is a Latin translation for the Greek terms for the masks characteristic of Greek drama. And the idea of persons has included thus an element of artifice and creativity from the very beginning, as distinct from simply static recognition, as distinct from I know one when I see one, right? There has been a calling out of different roles, different emotions, different states of being, all of this geared to managing recognition, right? Masks have their own wonderful history. If I were the right art historian or anthropologist for this, I could make the whole talk just about masks. But they do several things that I want to just call as a way of getting started. They identify roles, literally the roles players are assuming on the stage, but also they are part of the proximate move towards a theatrum mundi and a sense of all the world being a stage and of roles being how we project ourselves into the world, perform, and relate to others. They identify them in a version of Greek drama, a central version of Athenian drama, in which actors typically played multiple parts. So shifting masks was a way to signal that the same physical actor, right, was playing a different role. Since the actors were all male almost all the time, when it was a female role, that just meant a female mask over the male player. Now note that what that meant was that looking behind the mask and trying to see the natural person was not a meaningful way to get at what was going on exactly. It was about the artifice, it was about the aspects of identity, and literally aspects. None of these was trying to say this is the whole person, right? This is the person in shock, the person in anger. This is this character, that character, right? The masks facilitated transitions, So the different roles enabled recognition, and part of what the masks did in a large theater, right, was enable people seen in the back row to say, ah, it's the angry mask now, right, which was helpful. Right? And remember, it wasn't always a surprise because most of the plays were pretty well known to the audience most of the time, or variations on well-known routines. So the mask could encode expectations. And lots of what we do in the presentation of ourselves or the recognition of persons has to do with expectations, roles as expectations, aspects of complex reality, but also a guide to interaction. It's worth remembering that in the theater, as in life, people playing different roles interact with each other. Very, very, very few roles are performed as soliloquies, totally and separately from others. The Greek drama was also ritual. It was civic rites, among other things, intended to promote and encourage civic virtue, narrating the famous stories, including stories of the coming into being of the city, the coming into being of humans, the origins of life, which were important, the Dionysian rituals. This is the theater of Dionysius in Athens, the most important of the theaters. And the rituals are particularly attuned to transformations. The drama is largely about transformations. So there are moral norms, but they are embedded in stories of coming into being and often degenerating, breaking apart, losing coherence. So there's a making and a reaffirming of the values and narratives of life together, but these include accounts of things going wrong. Good citizens play specific roles in the pursuit of public good in an ideal polis. So as Athens liked to think of itself, although often it had to think of itself in terms of things going wrong, but it liked to think of itself as a good polis, right? And good citizens were making it good, but note they were making it good with different specific roles. Part of the idea of roles, it's differentiating. There's not just the Athenian person and everybody plays the Athenian person. There are different roles. So good people make good cities, a phrase which pops up more or less like that in Aristotle and in Cicero and all the way through to Aquinas, right? That good people make good cities, but also all of those thinkers and many others said good cities guide people. It goes both ways, right? The relationship between the good people making the good city is also that the good city will guide them towards virtue, towards the public good. And they are necessarily in a political as well as a personal project. Their pursuit of arete, their pursuit of excellence isn't just personal. So it's common sometimes to sort of extract the Nicomachean ethics out of Aristotle, to look at this as just projects of the personal. We don't read the politics as much for some good reasons in terms of the quality of what survived in the manuscript. But it's important to remember that for Aristotle, as for most of the ancient thinkers in this, human life was immediately and equally political and personal. We remember Aristotle saying that human beings are social animals. We remember him and other classical thinkers emphasizing the desire for community, the importance of seeking human relations, that this is not something added on to human life. It's in the essence of human life to seek community. And yet we tend to have most of our discussions of ethics in terms of individual decisions and to separate off the political, social, organizational questions. Later, Augustine would draw on an analogy between self and city. Right? Each of these is meant as a person for Augustine. Each of them is beset with most of the same sorts of familiar things that Augustine wrestles with. The difficulty of achieving unity and achieving alignment with God, right? Which is a problem for Rome and a problem for himself as he deals with sin, with guilt, with transgression, with weakness of will, with all of that. These can be attributes of a different kind of person as well. In this context, right, we all have roles to play. Right? The performance of these roles is not just a matter of learning the lines. It's not even just a matter of intellectually knowing what we are called by God to be or do, say finding a vocation in that sense. Right? It is also a matter of habituated capacities. Aristotle is enormously concerned with habit, with the ways in which we become, even physically, in an embodied form, but in a way that is a unity of mind and body, habituated to certain kinds of dispositions for action. And this habituation, this bodily hexis in which we find ourselves, is who we are, right? We aren't something else first, right? Purely human nature, who then gets these habits that he calls second nature. Because the original human nature is in need of and dependent on the ability to acquire these, whether they are the habits of speech or the habits of bodily posture, the ability to walk or whatever. Right? So the acquisition of second nature, an embodied, habituated process, which would become important to why Loyola could say, give me a child until he's 7 and the church will have him forever, or why Aquinas, the major translator, medieval period, for much of this from Aristotle, would dwell on this, produce the Latin term habitus as a translation of Aristotle's hexis, to talk about this, to emphasize that being human required learning. It wasn't entirely natural. Okay? You had to learn, and that learning had to be at least partially an embodied learning, to be what you would then experience as natural, but it was second nature in Aristotle's sense. And this was largely a matter of discipline, whether it was monastic discipline or the discipline of daily prayer or any of the varieties of kinds of discipline you can think of, the discipline of the athlete, the discipline of the actor, right? That it took discipline to habituate yourself. In other words, you could want to have better wants rather than this is Alistair MacIntyre talking about emotivism, but at any rate, right? There's a lot of modern thinking that kind of imagines we are the wants, the desires, the impulses we have, that they're just natural and we can't do anything about it. I remember my son telling me, well, I have ADHD, I can't do anything. That's just who I am. You know, actually, you can work on this. No, sorry. I tried to tell him that Aristotle said he could work on it and Aquinas said he could work on it, and he wasn't impressed. But he did work on it or he would never have grown up. But we have this idea of nature that is problematic, right? Because it misleads us about the extent to which we can remake who we are. Right? We can work on ourselves, we can want to have better wants, but also we will be remade in our experience of other people, of social relationships, and there are institutions which can help us, church or monastery, right? Family, school, right? There are a lot of institutions for helping us become people with a second nature that is good, that is productive for us, that works for us. And it's not always clear, as Aristotle writes about habit, and I think there are issues of translation, though my ancient Greek is, shall we say, extremely limited. Right? It can seem like this is all unconscious once it's habit. Right? Maybe it's not quite rote learning, which would imply you just memorize and repeat, but it's fully unconscious. Right? I used to play basketball on the high school team when I was in high school, and one of the features that was a problem is that it hadn't become second nature to me to know when to shoot, when to pass, and what to do. There was often a hesitation. Should I shoot or should I pass? And the moment of hesitation was, of course, extremely costly in the basketball game. resulted in humiliation for me when my coach walked out on the court, right, in front of however many people were watching our high school game in Henderson, Kentucky, and put his arm around me and said, "Calhoun, object of this game is put this here orange ball through that hoop up there. Next time you have your hands on this here orange ball, do that." Right? In a loud voice. Okay. But, right, that's not the only face of habit, that doing it without thinking, right? That is an important central part of it. And doing it without thinking doesn't mean just repetition. Right? So first, we have habits that we can be aware of. But second, even for those that work only when we're not aware of them, like being an actually good basketball player rather than me, right? It's still the case that they are generative. They enable us to do something, right? Not just to repeat what a teacher has done before us, but to judge a new situation and to make that decision, that instantaneous mental computation, is it right to shoot or pass, based on an awareness of where everybody else is on the court and what's going on, right? And of my own mediocre shooting abilities in this case, right? That right, is generative. And the point of disposition, which becomes much clearer as the tradition goes on, it's much clearer for Aquinas as he begins to write again about this than it is in some of the Aristotle originals, right? It's a disposition because it is the ability to improvise in new situations in ways that bear the fruit of the disciplined learning before. Being a good athlete is still just as good a way to think about this as anything else, right? The athlete has to be able to do slightly different things all the time, so to generate good things, right? Being a good musician, right? Being able to play with others, right, is adjustment. Not just if it's improvisational jazz music where absolutely this has to happen, but all of it. In the most rigidly structured Baroque quartet, you have to be attentive to the others to be able to play well. So the disposition of the habitus is generative. We grow in capacity to generate new actions, to be able to be better at being who we are, through interaction with others, who are often playing other roles. Right? They're doing something different. They may be playing other roles aimed at a similar good, cooperating with us, but they may not be. They may be at odds with us. Right? We grow in capacity through that. We play games, as I've already illustrated with my embarrassing personal examples, right? And as figure for children, and not only children, around the world, right? Playing of games is a way of learning, right? To interact, physical discipline, right? If you haven't been kicking the ball an awful lot, you're not going to be a good soccer player, right? Hours and hours and hours, right? So the play of games is serious business. The American sociologist George Herbert Mead, the pragmatist thinker, stressed a transition from play to game, though. You see children playing when they're sort of next to each other, doing similar things. I'm pushing my truck in the sandbox, you're pushing your truck in the sandbox. But you see a game when there are differentiated roles, and the ability of anyone to play depends on their awareness of the others. This is a first baseman, that's a pitcher, right? And the game of baseball depends on the differentiated roles. And it's a stage development that he was looking at for human beings, but it's basic to the idea of person. And we live, if we move into pictures that are at least illustrating a slightly more late medieval, early modern period, we move into multiple different domains. Part of what happens is that it becomes harder to talk about just the city and society. There's the market. There's the monastery, a very classic one, that's Monte Cassino, of course, bombed in World War II and rebuilt, so it's not quite ancient and all of that, but the one into which Aquinas' parents put him when he was 5, right? He didn't last until 7, and therefore it doesn't quite fit the Loyola stories, because of something that we find hard to imagine today. His parents took him out of a monastery because that seemed so dangerous and put him in a university. Because in the wars of that period in Italy, the Abbey of Monte Cassino was a target in a way that the University of Naples wasn't, right? We have education, that's the University of Paris, actually, not Naples, right? And we have the city itself. So I'm just evoking that each of these is an environment of discipline. Not in a negative sense, it's an environment in which you learn to be a person who has the capacity to deal with the market, for example, who has the intuitive as well as conscious capacity. And in relation to any or all of these, republics can be built in relation to ancient cities too, right? So this derives from Aristotle's Politeia. It gets transmuted through Greek republican thinking onto the Renaissance, and I'm not going to try to trace the history of republican thought in this, right? But the idea that I want to bring out of it is important, right? That cities can be created, that in relation to any of those disciplinary domains, the market or the city or the university, these are not just found, they are created and they can be transformed. They can be projects of design. So republicanism is, of course, about the public goods, right? But it's partly about designing the conditions in which we live to be conducive to achieving the public good. Okay? It's not just about telling people, please go do the public good, right? It's about creating circumstances in which people are led towards the public good. Now, not all the designers get it right, but they organize roles, they organize relationships, they celebrate virtues, including with the theater, but also in various other settings to try to keep people on a good path, right? But cities may degenerate, right? The story of Florence, the great classic Republican story of the early modern period, okay, is a story of degeneration and disaster as much as it is a story of building the model republic that would so influence thinkers during the English Civil War or the American Revolution, okay? And this idea that there's potential degeneration is important in all of that. You don't always get Savonarola, but sometimes you get Savonarola or someone very much like him, right? The issue of money is very often central, right? The picture in the lower left there is money and beauty, for those of you who don't know it. And so two of the things that are held to be sources of degeneration for even a very good city. Aristotle already spotted, right, something in the core of this. It wasn't just the presence of money, and it wasn't just poverty, and it wasn't misrule exactly. It was a kind of bad design, right? He said that political excellence requires balance among extremes. That's pretty much what he says about personal ethics, both ethics, right? Extremes of wealth and poverty, however, make a city not of free persons, but of slaves and masters. The ones consumed by envy, the others by contempt. So neither the slaves nor masters are in a situation that is conducive to the pursuit of the good at a personal level, and this is bad at the collective social level. So the inequality itself, the polarization, is destructive. That's bad design. Ever been anywhere where there's also polarization of wealth? Never mind. Right? Now, in the same era, right, there is a doctrine about monarchy that is significant. I'm not going to try to fill in the whole sort of chain to it, but just bear in mind, there's a lot of thinking here about a two-body problem, right? Not the famous three-body problem, but a two-body problem, right? So first, there's thinking about what is the church as a whole, right? And for a long time, the central conceptual framework, although there are different thinkers, they come up with different ideas, is of a mystical whole, a corpus mysticum, right? And there's a large body of thought about that. There is an idea then about a political analog to that, a corpus politicum, right? So if the church is mysteriously a single whole, right, this is developed at a time when nobody would see it exactly around the Pope in the same way, but from St. Peter on, right, you have an account of the church as unity, right? And you have any number of church councils to try to restore unity, and you have a vision of the whole, and you have a hierarchy, and you have all of this apparatus, but you also have mysteries, right? Multiple mysteries, transubstantiation, right? The mysteries in the various versions of the Mass, but the mysterium of the integral unity of the church, until, of course, you don't. And that becomes hard to evoke. And not just with Protestantism, but with the papal schism. Right? The corpus politicum idea is of a political body analogous to the church as a whole. It's used to talk about kingship, okay, a body. But the king's two bodies, and the model for the king's two bodies is the bishop's two bodies. The bishop as corporation sole, the bishop as a corporation of one would be the standard US legal way of saying that now. Right? You distinguish the personal property of the man who is a bishop from the office property of the bishop. Right? And the same thing gets extended to the king, famous topic of discussion. I know you've all read Oliver Kantoravich's book about this, so I won't go on about it. Right? Notice the anointing, right, of the king at the top. That's Edward the Confessor, if you care about that, by the bishops. This is a story that keeps kings subordinated to the church, at least symbolically, but it's also a story about when the physical king, the prince who is about to be made the king, becomes the sacred, symbolic king, second body, the corporation, actually, of the state. Right? The bottom, notice how similar the format is actually the ordination of a bishop. Right? So it's the same sort of logic that's being used here to create, right, a new kind of person, right, as the great British jurist Coke put it, framed by the policy of man. Right? The body politic, the corpus politicum, right, is framed by the policy of man, but it is a body. It's different from a natural body, which Coke thought was created by God. Right? So there are various versions of this, and it's radically different from what will emerge in the early modern period as social contract thinking. The idea of individuals coming together and making agreements to create rather than this kind of mysterium. One version of that will suffice to sum it up because it comes with the best graphic, and I'm selecting on the basis of pictures here, not intellectual content. This is not an endorsement. But, right, the famous frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan is an engraving trying to represent the state as the absolute king, writ large, with the chainmail of the king being many people, with different roles and different institutions represented, right? So the university, the church, the army, they're all there down in those lower panels. It's an account of how all the different roles of the kingdom are part of the king, the body politic, right? The kingdom itself. And the famous opening phrases are still instructive. I won't read out all that's there, but you can. Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things. So in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. And you can make a little artificial mechanical bird, or you can make England. Right? And that's Hobbes' point. It's possible to create. You can make England, or whatever state you create, stronger with bureaucracy. Think of bureaucracy as very much like an algorithm, a workflow, a structure of rules that organize a process to help make the modern state, that separate private people from their official roles. Right? You're not supposed to take money other than your salary when you're in the bureaucratic office. So this is a difference from early, more feudal modes, right? The relationships are instrumentalized. You might become friends, but it's not supposed to turn on being friends, right? It turns on formal relationships. Everyone has a part to play in a centrally ordained play in a bureaucracy that is ordering, not simply serving or reflecting, it's ordering the being of a nation. It's managing and creating it and doing things that will intensify it. So this is further building the mechanical bird, or England, if you will. Now business corporations come into this, the most famous artificial persons, right? The East India companies are the first great early modern business companies, the Dutch East India and the British East India Company. It's just, not always remembered that at its height, the British East India Company controlled a quarter of the global economy, right? More than any country, more than the rest of Britain, besides the East India Company, let alone any other country, right? The Dutch East India Company was the first joint stock company, meaning a corporation in much the same legal sense that we think of corporations now. It was entwined with the structure of the United Provinces. It had a political province. It was created for political as well as economic persons. It was governed in political ways, for example, with a board that had representatives from different provinces, not just shareholders. The British company was also a joint stock company, though Britain actually banned joint stock companies after 1720, when there was a massive fraudulent scheme, the South Sea Bubble and all that. So for a long time, there were partnerships and no corporations, right? But I'm not going to tell you about that, but just think about the complexities and the differences, which you can kind of figure out. What does it mean to have 75 partners in an unlimited general partnership versus creating corporation as a control problem? But then think about some other early modern corporations like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Plymouth Company, right? And other colonization companies, all of which were created as business enterprises and became states. Okay? They were given charters by the British Crown, right? So the state called into being these other corporations as business corporations, which themselves then created states. Came about from it. Peoples and nations are there in Europe, and we're there in Rome. We get the word nation from the Roman word for people who aren't Roman, basically, for people who are not citizens, are not subject to the civil law of Rome, who are governed by ethnicity and descent and kinship, hence nation, lineage. All right, so there's been cultural commonalities, but there's a transformation of them in this period, and given time, I'm not going to go on about it, right, in which there is an effort to line them up with these states that are being made. Think of it as the hyphenization effort, nation, state. Let's make that hyphen work. In order to make that hyphen work, why don't we kill, right, the Protestants in France, right? Or, right, that was St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, right? There are similar pogroms and similar ethnic cleansings around the European countries. So after the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, there are a variety of changes, right? The Peace of Westphalia is mostly about defeat of the Habsburg projects and other projects of uniting a European empire, making something come alive on the basis of the old Holy Roman Empire, building the Franco-German version of this, or the Franco-Spanish version of this, but, right, has various effects, right? Whoever is king, prince actually is the word used, will decide the religion of the people. Okay? It's not a bottom-up thing, right? So wars of religion in the Protestant era at stake. The role of priests who had been preeminent diplomats before, because the major people who are competent linguistically and literate to be able to be the go-betweens and all of this, essentially vanish from this role, right? And there is an effort to reorganize the face of Europe in this nation-state model with pre-existing sort of ideas, but in a sense, France was not the hexagon before this. And French people didn't speak French, and even the modern process of getting more and more of them to speak French hadn't gotten underway in earnest And it's not until 1850 that the majority of French people speak French. Right? So this is a pretty dramatic transformation. You can't just sort of say, of course, always people have had these cultural identities. Hinges on these new mechanical birds or states. Right? And often forgotten in the story of the rise of the nation state, simultaneously with the creation of the nation state at home, Europeans create colonies overseas. Right? Simultaneously, the East India companies should give you a clue to this. It's not later. They organize, they become strong as nations, and then they go conquer overseas countries. It is simultaneous that there is this project of colonization of the world. And versions of that have been going on. So in the Spanish-speaking world, they've yielded disputes over the treatment of the native people of the New World, coming to a head in the Valladolid disputations, Sepulveda and de las Casas debating. Right? The humanist, by the way, always given our modern usage of words, it's always tricky to remember that it's the humanist who defends slavery, Aristotelian natural slavery, and the harsher treatment of the Native Americans. Right? De las Casas is somewhat milder in this. It's a different path. And various things are debated, but in the background of the whole debate is who is a human? And what kind of human? Are there humans in waiting who will be human after they've been educated or matured or evolved for a while? Right? And this is conducted in very Aristotelian terms around the idea of discipline and the idea of self-government by reason. Because the argument against rights for the peoples of the New World is that they can't govern themselves. The higher parts of them can't govern the lower parts of them. The rational parts can't govern the impulsive parts. The peaceful can't govern the violent, say the Spanish who are killing them. One of the interesting things about the whole colonial era, not just the Spanish, is seeing natives without at the same time seeing colonialism or capitalism or enslavement. The building of plantation economies and the way they depend on a slave trade. Right? This is all going on at the same time, and yet there is this discourse about finding the native, seeing the native, right? As either Rousseau's natural communism or the nasty, brutish, and short world of Hobbes. Tribes are cast as important corporate persons. And they exist in some places, not others, but throughout much of the colonial world, there's a push to create tribes where they don't exist for the sake of colonial government, so that there is a unitary body which can do things like sell land, right? Or engage in trade relations, or be held collectively liable for misdeeds by its members. Okay? So there's horrible stories of American Indians are part of this. Right? Creation of and hardening of the boundaries of tribes. Great works like Sir Henry Maine's Status and Contract shaped this. They suggest that old-time peoples, those tribesmen and our ancestors, were just governed by the positions they held, like the roles in the theater, right? And they didn't have freedom. And contract meant freedom. In this new society in which everything could be bought and sold, like the land you lived on, the house you lived in, the shirt off your back, there was freedom, right? Not in the world that was created out of the relationships that held people together. And we need to ask what it means to resist the idea of inherited status in this. What about kinship, clanship, age sets, all those things anthropologists study about how societies are organized, including societies that do not have native chiefs or kings, but are organized acephalous,ly, that work on the basis of networks, like anarchists before the time, right? But they're not anarchists in the sense that they're like a bunch of hippies in Barcelona, right? They are anarchists in the sense that they have very strong commitments to social relations, which they experience as very binding, those other people playing other roles around them, right? which structures who they are and what they can do. They live in corporate segments, like a lineage segment or a clan, but these are fluid and nested often. They aren't unilateral, the way that General Motors or something is unilateral, at least partially. And they live with ancestors as persons, right? And persons that have social roles. So they may worship or pray to ancestors, but living with ancestors means things like remembering the ancestors who are crucial to the differentiation of your village and lineage from others around. So you can forget ancestors who didn't have offspring, who were critical to that sort of distinction. You remember the ones who were. They lived in a often personified nature. Right? These charts, which come from books by Meyer Fortes, are about the people on the lower level here, the Talensi. So worth just being concrete. They're real people. You can look at a picture of them. They're not just abstractions in a book. They're still there in northern Ghana to this day. But I also back up to call your attention to the anti-slavery medal at the top, which has its own interesting story, struck by Josiah Wedgwood, the China maker, important Methodist anti-slavery activist, right? But what is the slogan, right? Am I not a man and a brother? A slogan that would reverberate, mixing two different languages for thinking about personhood. I'm in the category man, I'm a human, you've got to treat me with respect. Or we are all brothers, there should be respect in this. Now, character and characters and masks continue to have a history into our present day in various ways. And I just want to call attention to the extent to which masks are embedded in the thinking that becomes the idea of character, often called in German, there's our character mask. These are part of having character, right? And it figures in the psychoanalytic traditions and other philosophical traditions as part of this. Recognizing how late it's getting, I'll be quick. So these appear in ritual, but they appear in the growing proficiency of people's ability to live their lives by living up to the different expectations or scripts embodied in the multiple roles they hold. So pretty much nobody plays just one role, right? They are child or parent, but also worker, right? Parishioner, student, right? Bad basketball player, right? They have multiple roles, and part of what they're managing is their own ability to deal with that. They grow in proficiency, and their ability is managed in part by these masks. Freudians would call them defense mechanisms, but a sort of a misleading term in a way, right? Marx has an interesting comment on it in which he says, people always want to unmask, but they expect to see pure nature if they pull away the mask. What you see is the contradictions of society that are focused into the role that the mask describes. So does unmasking really work as a strategy for truth? Getting almost into the contemporary era here, not quite. Note the bottom picture, right? Corporations. The most pivotal case that made the corporation part of US constitutional law is a case in 1819 decided by Chief Justice Marshall in Dartmouth versus Woodward that establishes the principle of limited liability. Applies to ordinary investments now. You go out and buy some stock. If the company tanks, you lose what you paid for your stock, but you can't be held liable for any other debts or misdeeds of the company. Okay? That's decided in a case about a university, a college as it was then. As Justice Marshall wrote, an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of law, and thus famously, he said, with no soul to damn, no body to kick. Right? Two modes of punishment, two modes of discipline, an errant firm, an errant person, neither of which applied to a corporation. Yet, he said, the corporation would be a legal person. And henceforth, corporations would be able to sue and be sued, to own contracts, right? They would have the rights of personhood, right? But I want to, before I leave these pictures, say corporations can develop different characters, right? This should be a reminder that artificial persons aren't stamped out of a mold any more than other human persons are stamped out of a mold. Notre Dame is not Dartmouth and not vice versa, but also, right, universities are not biological research firms or auto companies or airlines, right? You can create a lot of different kinds of things. Currently, we experience corporations often in terms of their headquarters and giant office buildings and faces, but actually we experience them in many ways in our lives. We order from Amazon, we go to restaurants that turn out to be owned by distant companies and so forth, right? It's a relatively poorly regulated sector, though it complains about how regulated it is. It's surprisingly minimally recognized in social theory. In, say, international relations theory, which, as the name suggests, thinks that global society is organized by relations among nation states and has a basically minimal attention to corporations. Though you might think that Huawei and Google matter in global affairs, or Exxon and Mobil or others, right? The corporate form is central to the scale of modern society. We literally couldn't have a country as big as we have, let alone the global economy that we have, without corporations as well as infrastructure that we also don't pay enough attention to. And corporations are deeply implicated in extreme inequality, although often in the background, because we imagine inequality among wealth, we imagine that corporate inequality translates into the riches of the people who own the stock in the company, and we don't consider that the nature of the corporation itself is that it doesn't die and have to redistribute its assets, including to its incompetent nephew, Joe, right? So there is a potential for an almost limitless accumulation that is a basic asymmetry. But it's not all negative, because corporations are also places where people work, places where they meet their partners, places where they have friends, places where they have lives. And for many people, corporations are more basic to the healthcare they have, and they offer more community than the town in which they live. Okay, so curious feature of our society. Now AI, which others will be talking about more in this conference, joins corporations as part of a system of social relations that is experienced not as social relations, but as impersonal, distant connections that are beyond human control, because the steps that would be involved in getting between you and the human control are so many that it just seems an abstract system. Integral, again, to rapid social change and redefining the web of relationships through which we live in society, for good or ill, and again, with very little regulation or democratic choice about what's going on. The literature and our ordinary public discussions are confusingly full of contrast between natural persons and corporations, where it's assumed we know what the natural persons are. Right? So the most important sociology book on corporations is The Asymmetric Society by James Coleman. It's a really good book in many ways, but throughout, it just talks about the asymmetry between natural persons, who will die eventually, and corporations who will not necessarily die in the same time frame, and otherwise draws that contrast, but doesn't stop to ask, are the natural persons male or female? Are the natural persons in fully abled or disabled bodies? Are the natural persons young or old? Are the natural persons, right, white? Right? So the natural person is actually a much more complicated category than is often suggested. And natural persons have changed a lot over time. We are a lot taller. I can tell you that as a bad amateur basketball player, that now I used to be tall. I'm actually pretty much the same height I was when I was in the 9th grade, and then I was tall, and now I'm not. All right? People are taller. Nutrition is better. Health is better. I work in China recurrently, almost every year. Often used to engage in pickup basketball games with a variety of people around the hotels and things like that. And I would stand out a head taller That's long gone, right? In 2 generations, nutrition has changed, the height of change. So the natural person is not exactly a fixed category in all of this, though legal statuses may be relatively fixed. And the natural person is a description of human beings as discrete, as though the human beings end at the end of their skin, rather than being enmeshed in the world in complicated ways. Now, created persons are imagined often as robots, but what I've very briefly hinted is actually that barely scratches the surface of AI. AI is much more about transforming systems, like the nuclear defense system or the air traffic system or the tax system or all kinds of things than it is just having humanoid robots. But in any case, personhood is changed by it in a variety of ways. The way we develop second nature is changed by it. I have a friend who's very disturbed by his granddaughter thinking she has slaves. Alexa, turn on the TV. Right? We relate to even relatively primitive AIs as persons that we can control in ways that we usually aren't allowed to control persons, right? And we don't recognize relationships clearly, though we relate to them all the time and talk to them in various ways. We should be recognizing them as related. We should be being moral about it. We aren't. And we should understand fairness and goodness and all of that, not just as distributional among human beings, but as qualities of relationships, including relationships mediated with technologies. You'll be glad to know this is the last slide. There were no more pictures to find, so let me get to the key takeaway from it. Right? So states set rules for corporations. That's what that Dartmouth College decision is about. The government says, we're going to let corporations have limited liability if they fill out the right paperwork. Right? We're going to give them a variety of other privileges, not just the contracts of the owning property and entering into relationships with others, and suing in court. All of personhood. We may, as the US did a decade ago, say that they have constitutional rights as citizens. Right? Perhaps they should. Rights like free speech. Why not? They are a kind of person. We recognize them as persons in other ways. It is interesting that it took the United States nearly 200 years after it was founded to recognize women as full persons. It was much quicker to recognize business corporations as full persons entitled to all protection of the Constitution. But, all right. One of the privileges corporations have in the way they are set up and given their charters by governments, including ours, although not actually quite all in the world, is they are allowed to sell themselves. You are not allowed to sell yourself. You cannot decide to go sell yourself into slavery. You can't say, my wife needs an operation and I'm going to go sell myself into slavery to pay for it. You may or may not get away with selling bits of your body, right? But in general, it is forbidden to sell yourself. Forbidden to sell yourself into slavery and forbidden to sell yourself in other forms. But corporations do precisely that, right? Stock exchanges are for trading ownership of corporations. Now, it turns out the control of corporations is in the hand of managers, not owners, and there's a sort of complicated relationship there. But it is instructive to think about this surprising feature that we have invented a kind of person that can be a slave and that can be sold after banning that for other kinds of persons. And we've given the new kind of person an enormous amount of power and treat it as almost objective. We say, I don't know if we can pierce the corporate veil, if we can pull off the mask and look behind the corporation. We just have to treat it as an entity. Right? If you have a dispute with a company over rent or the loan for your car or something, you generally cannot pierce the corporate veil. You generally cannot pull off the mask. You cannot get to somebody behind it, your dealings are with the corporation. And if every time you call, you get a different person because that's the way the corporation's organized, that's the way it is, right? Or they might do it better. They might work better. Corporations vary. They can work better or worse. We could vary the rules in various ways. We could have somewhat different rules, just like those Republican thinkers, right, from Rome through to Florence, said cities must be designed, not simply found, right? We need to give cities good constitutions to organize them well. We could do the same with corporations. Before the middle of the 19th century, corporations could only be set up with a charter in which they said, this is the public good we are going to do. Give us the privilege of being a corporation in return for the public good we are going to do. You got hospitals and charities and colleges and some business corporations, right? We no longer require that. It's more or less an of-will thing. If you filled out the paperwork right, write the contract. But the last point is it's not about investment, because the creation of the corporation is done by the people who petition the government and say, give us this right, before there are any investors. Before anyone is invested in it, it has to get created, which is done politically between the people who created it and the company. The rules could be changed to make corporations more pro-social, to broaden their relations to different societal counterparts or stakeholders, their workers, the communities in which they work. Imagine just that. Provisions that said corporations have intrinsic obligations to the environmental health of the communities in which they work, and that you couldn't get a corporation chartered without saying that. It would be different. Thank you.
Friends, we have refreshments out in the hall here. We can continue our conversation, but in the interest of time and so that we can enjoy the refreshments that we have and continue the conversation with our wonderful guest, I'm going to adjourn this part of the evening, and we will resume the formal program tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., but that doesn't end our conversation. Please enjoy the refreshments and continue conversation with our wonderful guest, Craig, and give him one more round of applause, please.